The labels are still there. Walk through the royal residences today, through the long corridors of Windsor, through the receiving rooms at Buckingham Palace, and you can still find small notes in the same handwriting, identifying pieces of furniture, porcelain, and silver. Not a curator's stamp, not a museum tag printed on an institutional card. The handwriting belongs to Queen Mary of Teck, who spent the better part of 50 years walking those rooms with a pen, marking what was history, what was hers, and increasingly, what was both. Tiny notes in her precise hand. A silver candelabra with the cipher of George IV. She would note the date, the provenance, the connection to a specific royal event. A piece of Chinese jade, the dynasty, the acquisition date, the story of how it came to be in the room. One observer described the result vividly. There is scarcely a piece of furniture in a royal residence that doesn't have a label written in the old queen's hand. Vanity Fair confirmed this characterization in 2021 from the biographical record. Every object catalogued, every history preserved, every acquisition logged in a system only she fully understood. She was, according to the Addingham Trust, an institutional authority on British royal collections, the first member of the royal family to approach those collections in their historical context, not as possessions to be enjoyed, but as a record to be curated and controlled. The Gemological Institute of America, in a formal scholarly publication, described her simply as an avid jewelry collector. She swelled the royal collection's holdings with what Apollo magazine, drawing on a 2021 institutional study, documented as more than 2,000 paintings, books, photographs, and decorative objects over the course of her tenure. She rehung the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. She created virtual museums of her beloved possessions in royal residences. She had the royal librarian, Owen Morshead, help her catalog collections that stretched back centuries, including objects that had belonged to Queen Charlotte. She called collecting "my one great hobby." In 1909, before she was even queen, she wrote to her Aunt Augusta, "I am very busy now, seeing that our various inventories are correct and that everything is entered as far as possible with its history. It's really rather wonderful what we have managed to collect and get together since we married. Quite a creditable collection of family things, without spending much money over it. I confess, I feel rather proud of our endeavors. I hope you won't laugh at me." That letter isn't quite the confessional it sounds. There is pleasure in it, but underneath the self-deprecation there is the voice of a woman who has been working systematically for years and knows exactly what she has accomplished. That word, history, is the key to everything. Not beauty, not fashion. History. Queen Mary valued objects for what they carried, for their provenance, their dynastic meaning, their weight as records of the family she had married into and spent her life serving. A piece that had belonged to George IV wasn't merely valuable, it was evidence. A piece with no history was merely decorative. She wrote to a fellow collector in 1914, "It always seems strange to me that there can be people to whom these things mean and say nothing to them. I confess I pity them as they miss much in life." Kenneth Rose, the historian who wrote extensively about the royal family, captured her acquisitional instinct in a single phrase. The Queen brought both knowledge and the wiles of the predator to her collecting. Biographer Anne Edwards in Matriarch, Queen Mary and the House of Windsor, documented what that looked like in practice. London antique dealers were known to hide their best pieces when they heard she was coming to visit. Aristocratic hosts developed a protocol. Move the valuables to the attic before Queen Mary arrived, bring down the less precious items, and hope she didn't ask about the gaps. Princess Olga Romanov, recalling the social reality from first-hand family accounts, described the dynamic bluntly. She'd say, "Ooh, I do like this chair," and you'd be obliged to give her all 12. The book Royal Fever puts it plainly. Queen Mary was known for admiring treasures at people's homes until her host and hostess got the hint and offered her the items as gifts. The acquisition method was social pressure at its most refined, not theft, not demand, but the quiet application of a queen's admiration in a room full of people who understood what such admiration implied. This matters because it reframes everything that follows. Queen Mary didn't simply collect jewels. She edited them. She controlled their futures. The tiaras she chose not to wear, or to dismantle, or to redirect, are the sharpest records of how her mind actually worked. Not the pieces on her head. The pieces she decided could serve the dynasty better in other forms, on other heads, in designs of her own making. In the early 20th century, a tiara wasn't jewelry. It was a sentence in a language that royal and aristocratic society read fluently. The rules had been clear for decades. Tiaras were for married women only, a visible marker of marital status. They appeared exclusively at white tie events, state dinners, and formal balls, and were never, by convention, worn before 5 o'clock in the afternoon. A queen's choice of tiara at a state occasion communicated her relationship to the occasion, to tradition, and to the other people in the room. The piece she wore for a diplomatic dinner said something different than the piece she wore to a jubilee celebration. The piece she was photographed in most frequently became associated with her publicly, a signature as readable as a monogram. Within the royal family specifically, tiaras functioned as dynastic property rather than personal possessions. They were held, lent, and transferred in accordance with rank and occasion. A tiara passed from a senior royal to a younger member of the family was a statement of favor, approval, and continuity. One kept back was a statement of something else. Queen Victoria, tellingly, almost never appeared wearing a tiara in her final decades. The choice to not wear one was itself communicative, a statement of perpetual mourning, of withdrawal from the social display that tiaras represented. The object's absence signaled as clearly as its presence would have. Queen Mary understood this grammar entirely. She wore tiaras. She wore them extensively, and formal portraits show her in them across 5 decades of public life. That is precisely why the documented gaps, pieces she owned for years and was rarely or never photographed wearing, carry so much analytical weight. For a woman who clearly knew what a tiara said, the decision not to wear one was never passive. She also understood something that most of her contemporaries seemed to feel less strongly about. A tiara could be worth more as raw material than as a received object. The sentimental form an object arrived in wasn't necessarily its most useful form. A diamond fringe tiara from 1893 might yield better results if dismantled and rebuilt to her specification in 1919. The specific historical associations layered onto a piece by its donor weren't necessarily the associations the dynasty needed going forward. This wasn't entirely outside period practice. Jewelry alteration was common enough in the Edwardian and interwar years that no single alteration would have drawn unusual notice. What distinguished Queen Mary was the volume, the systematic nature, and the consistent targeting of pieces with the heaviest sentimental provenance. She didn't alter pieces from anonymous sources. She altered gifts, specific, documented, meaningful gifts. And she replaced them with objects expressing her own dynastic vision. That pattern, across 30 years of alterations, all executed through the same crown jeweler, isn't refashioning. It's a program. July 6, 1893, Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. Princess May of Teck, 26 years old, marries Prince George, Duke of York. The wedding gifts that day were staggering in their variety and volume. The guest list alone ran to royalty from half a dozen European courts. But among the gifts, 4 tiaras arrived that day with particular weight, each one carrying not just the generosity of a donor, but the organized goodwill of thousands of people who had pooled subscriptions and committee decisions to express what Princess May meant to them as the future queen. The people of Surrey presented her with a convertible diamond fringe tiara, over 300 brilliant diamonds, fashioned so that it could be worn as either a tiara or dismantled and worn as a necklace. An entire county's formal tribute to their new duchess. The Ladies of England, a formal committee of 650 women, gave her another tiara. Diamonds and pearls worked together into a piece that had been selected, paid for, and approved by a rolling consensus of British womanhood. A fundraising committee organized by Lady Eva Greville, who would become one of Mary's ladies-in-waiting, had raised enough money through hundreds of individual contributions to purchase a tiara from Wolfe & Company through Gerard. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, 14 upright teardrop pearls rising from a scrollwork base of diamonds. And a fourth piece came from Prince George himself, purchased from Collingwood & Company at what appears to have been the suggestion or direction of Queen Victoria. A convertible diamond fringe necklace and tiara, sometimes called the Collingwood fringe, that carried with it the imprimatur of the most famous woman in Britain. 4 tiaras in a single day, each one carrying specific, documented human meaning. The Surrey residents who wanted their duchess to have something beautiful, the women of England who expressed their collective goodwill in diamonds and pearls, the ladies of the court who organized subscriptions and selection committees, Queen Victoria, directing an act of generosity through the bridegroom. Stand in that room with those objects and understand what they represented, not just wealth, but relationship. These were objects through which hundreds of thousands of people said something to Princess May. They said, "You belong to us now, and we are glad." Within 20 years, at least 3 of those 4 pieces were unrecognizable, and within 26 years, the 4th was gone too. In 1913, Queen Mary sent 2 tiaras to Gerard within the same calendar year. The Surrey diamond fringe, the county's 300 diamond gift from 2 decades earlier, had accumulated no documented photographic wearings by Queen Mary in the period between 1893 and 1913. The absence of photographs isn't identical to proof of deliberate non-wearing. The photographic record of any single piece across those decades is incomplete. But the fact is that when Queen Mary decided to act on the Surrey fringe in 1913, the piece she chose to act on wasn't a tiara she had worn regularly and was now setting aside. She had it dismantled. Gerard took it apart systematically. The 13 largest diamonds were extracted and identified separately. They were then used to replace the original pearl finials on top of the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, the third of the 1893 wedding gifts. The remaining stones from the Surrey fringe were directed into an entirely new piece, what became known as the Gloucester honeysuckle tiara. The Surrey diamond fringe, as an object, as a form, as the county's gift, ceased to exist. That same year, the Ladies of England tiara went to Gerard. The piece that 650 women had organized, funded, and selected to give to the new Duchess of York was dismantled. Its diamonds and pearls were removed and catalogued. They didn't disappear. Queen Mary had a purpose for them. They became the primary material for a new commission, a tiara of her own specification that replicated a piece owned by her maternal grandmother, Princess Augusta of Hesse, the Duchess of Cambridge. The original piece, reportedly created around 1818 by a German jeweler as a wedding gift, featured 19 diamond arches in the form of lovers' knots, each suspending a hanging pearl. Queen Mary wanted her own version, and she was going to build it from the materials available. To complete the new piece, she needed more pearls. She found them on the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, the same tiara that had just received the 13 Surrey diamonds the year before. In 1914, the original 14 upright teardrop pearls that had topped the girl's tiara since 1893 were removed. They were incorporated into the new Lover's Knot Commission. The girl's tiara had now been transformed twice in consecutive years, receiving diamonds from one dismantled piece, surrendering its own original pearls to another new one. Executed by E. Wolfe & Co. for Gerard, the resulting Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, 19 diamond arches, 19 hanging pearls, built from the materials of the Ladies of England tiara, and the stripped pearls from the girl's tiara, supplemented with other diamonds and pearls from Queen Mary's collection, was finished in 1913 or 1914. It was a tribute to her grandmother's aesthetic. It was built on the deliberate destruction of a gift from 650 women who had given it to honor a different set of associations entirely. Picture the Gerard workshop in those years, the pieces arriving from the palace, the skilled hands dismantling settings, extracting stones, noting their characteristics. The 13 largest Surrey diamonds being set aside in their tray, the Ladies of England pearls counted and arranged, the girl's tiara brought in, its original pearl finials carefully removed, one by one, and catalogued, each stone going somewhere it had not been before, according to a plan laid out in advance by a woman who had already decided what the materials needed to become. This wasn't improvisation. The 1913 cluster, 2 major dismantlings within a single calendar year, both feeding the same commission, is the clearest evidence in the entire record that Queen Mary operated from a program. She had decided what she wanted to build, she identified the available raw materials, she directed the transformation, and she rarely wore the result herself. In 1919, 6 years after the 1913 dismantlings, Queen Mary returned to Gerard with the Collingwood fringe. The convertible diamond piece, received at her 1893 wedding, had originated essentially as a gift from Queen Victoria via Prince George. It was the most charged of the 4 1893 tiaras, in terms of who had sanctioned it. This wasn't the goodwill of anonymous subscribers, but the directed generosity of a reigning queen who had chosen Princess May as a bride, approved the match, and organized the family's formal endorsement. Queen Victoria died in January 1901. By 1919, 18 years after Victoria's death, Queen Mary sent the Collingwood fringe to Gerard and had its diamonds reconfigured. The resulting piece, 47 graduated diamond bars, separated by 46 narrower spikes, still convertible as a necklace, is what we now call the Queen Mary Diamond Fringe Tiara, the Kokoshnik style. The new form Queen Mary had specified. The original form, the specific expression of Victorian patronage, was gone. She wore the resulting tiara. It appeared in a documented portrait of her wearing it in 1926. What she built from Victoria's original gift has subsequently been worn by Princess Elizabeth on her wedding day in 1947, and the Tatler account of that morning is specific enough to be worth including. On the morning of that wedding, according to the Queen's own later account, she accidentally touched the clasp on the tiara, unaware that it was also a necklace, and the spring gave way. Gerard was on hand and fixed it. The Queen Mother reportedly remained composed. "We have 2 hours, and there are other tiaras." Princess Anne wore the same diamond fringe tiara, rebuilt from Victoria's original gift, on her wedding day, on November 14, 1973, to Captain Mark Phillips. An estimated 500 million people watched that ceremony on television. Princess Beatrice wore it at her wedding to Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi in July 2020. The piece Queen Mary rebuilt from Victoria's gift has now graced 3 royal weddings across 5 decades, with likely more to come. The piece Victoria gave is unrecoverable. What Queen Mary chose to build from it has outlasted the original form by a century. The Vladimir tiara arrived in 1921 through a completely different transaction. Paris. the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The city had become a city of exiles. Former princes and grand duchesses, imperial officers and aristocrats, living in reduced circumstances in hotel rooms and rented flats, quietly selling whatever they had managed to carry out of Russia to stay solvent. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Younger was among them. Her mother, Grand Duchess Vladimir, Maria Pavlovna the Elder, had amassed one of the finest private jewelry collections in Imperial Russia, setting up a court at Vladimir Palace in St. Petersburg that rivaled the Tsar's own in the brilliance of its display. That collection had been smuggled out of Russia after the revolution, piece by piece, through connections and couriers. By 1921, the daughter was in Paris. The money was running out. Queen Mary purchased the Vladimir tiara from her, 15 intertwined diamond circles, each containing a hanging pearl drop, made by Bolin, the Russian court jeweler in the late 1800s. The circumstances of the transaction, the price paid relative to the piece's value, are matters of continuing historical debate. What is documented is the purchase date, 1921. Queen Mary didn't preserve the piece in its received form. Almost immediately, she had it modified. The pearl drops were made interchangeable with emerald drops from the Cambridge collection. The structure was also designed so the tiara could be worn without any pendant drops at all, creating a lighter, cleaner profile, what Elizabeth II would later reportedly describe as quieter. 3 configurations from one piece: pearls, emeralds, or nothing. The modularity Queen Mary engineered into a purchase she made in 1921 was still being used by her granddaughter 50 years later. She wore the Vladimir. She deployed it with a deliberateness she brought to all her significant pieces. But she also reshaped it immediately, before it had been in her possession long enough to accumulate any specific associations in its received form. The logic is consistent throughout the collection. An object arrives, she assesses its potential, and she optimizes it for future use, rather than preserving it as given. The question of what Queen Mary actually wore, rather than owned and modified or held and redirected, is more complex than the title suggests. The honest answer from the photographic record is that it's patchy. One documented photograph shows her wearing the lover's knot tiara in 1935, and notably, without its pearl toppers, in the stripped-down version she had arrived at by removing some of the most elaborate elements. Before that, a 1926 portrait shows her in the diamond fringe tiara she had rebuilt from the Collingwood piece. State occasions and formal dinners from across her reign show the Delhi Durbar parure, the imperial suite she had commissioned for the 1911 Delhi Durbar in India, assembled specifically for that occasion, with the Cullinan 3 and 4 diamonds incorporated as interchangeable elements. That parure was her consistent choice for maximum state display. The suite built for empire, worn at empire's most formal moments. Pearls were her signature across nearly every formal photograph across 5 decades. Rope after rope of them, worn high on her neck in the manner that became her most recognizable visual characteristic. The pearls communicated antiquity, wealth, and a kind of serene dynastic confidence that required no explanation. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. That piece she had spent 2 years reshaping, stripping the original pearls and receiving new diamonds in their place, appears almost absent from her own wearing record. Gerard's official history of the piece, written by their designer Claire Scott, states it plainly. Originally gifted to Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth II really made the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara her own. From the jeweler who made it, maintained it, and watched 2 queens handle it across 60 years, that sentence implies something precise about who actually wore it. Elizabeth II wore it so consistently, in official portraits, on currency, in state photographs across her entire reign, that it became one of the most recognizable images of the Second Elizabethan era. The piece is now worn by Queen Camilla. Those 13 diamonds currently visible in the tiara's scrollwork on Camilla's head are the 13 largest diamonds from the Surrey diamond fringe, the wedding gift from Surrey's residence that Queen Mary received in 1893 and dismantled in 1913. Those stones have now outlasted the form they arrived in, the form they were first transferred to, the owner who redirected them, and 2 subsequent wearers. Queen Mary decided their fate in a single year, and they are still living out that decision. The Teck crescent tiara was different from all of these. Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, Duchess of Teck, Queen Mary's mother, died in 1897. The tiara associated with her, a crescent design of diamonds, came to Queen Mary after her death. It remained in the collection for over 40 years. In those 4 decades, there is no documented photograph of Queen Mary wearing it in public. No formal portrait with the Teck crescent on her head. No state occasion. In March 1939, more than 4 decades after she received it, the Teck crescent was publicly worn for the first time since it had entered Queen Mary's possession. The wearer wasn't Queen Mary. It was Queen Elizabeth, then the wife of King George VI, and later the Queen Mother, to whom Queen Mary had passed the peace. One account frames the non-wearing this way. Wearing her mother's tiara would have felt like stepping into Princess Mary Adelaide's identity, overwriting a memory she had chosen to preserve intact. That interpretation, treating the piece as a memorial rather than a resource, represents the one documented moment in this story where sentiment may have governed the choice more clearly than utility. Queen Mary kept the Teck crescent in its received form. She didn't dismantle it. She didn't modify it. She held it for 40 years without wearing it, and then passed it to someone who could carry it forward on new terms. This is worth noting specifically because it complicates the portrait. Queen Mary wasn't incapable of a sentimental relationship with an object. She expressed those feelings through restraint and redirection rather than display. The Teck crescent stayed in the box because she felt something about it that made wearing it impossible. The result, in practice, looked identical to her treatment of pieces she avoided for purely strategic reasons. Both sat unworn for decades, but the motivation was different. The distinction matters. It makes her more human and more complex than the pure strategist reading allows. She felt things. She expressed them in the only register available to her: silence, absence, an object held carefully in the dark. Queen Mary had 6 children. The word most consistently used in the biographical record for her relationship with them is remote. Not absent in the practical sense. She attended the formal occasions, she maintained correspondence, she performed the ceremonies of motherhood. But Anne Edwards, in Matriarch, Queen Mary and the House of Windsor, argued carefully that her almost complete inability to function as a mother directly led to her eldest son's immaturity and his eventual abdication of the crown. James Pope Hennessy, who wrote the authorized biography after extensive interviews with people who had known her intimately, recorded her attitude toward her newborn children in terms that were stark for an official document. Lady Airlie, Mabel, Countess of Airlie, who served as her lady-in-waiting for decades and documented what she saw in her memoir, Thatched with Gold, described her as someone who observed her own children with a kind of careful, sympathetic detachment that wasn't quite love and wasn't quite indifference, but occupied some territory between them that had no good name. Edwards wrote of her stoicism as double-edged. It made her admirable under pressure, and it made her a difficult mother. The children who grew up in her household learned that emotional display wasn't available and not expected. Bertie, the future George VI, developed a debilitating stammer and clung to the bottom of his scholastic and social rankings for years, living in the shadow of a father whose standards were impossible, and a mother whose approval was expressed through the quality of his preparation, rather than the warmth of her presence. Edward, the eldest, was talented and charming and eventually ungovernable in precisely the ways that children who receive consistent standards, but inconsistent warmth, sometimes become. When Edward VIII abdicated in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, Queen Mary's response was managed, formal, and devastating in its control. She had loved the monarchy more than she had ever been able to love her children as individuals, not because she was without feeling, but because the monarchy was the project to which she had given everything, and her eldest son had treated it as disposable. The abdication crisis lasted weeks. Her response, in the official record, was dignified and firm. The institution must survive. The succession must be secured. And the cost? Her eldest son's departure from everything she had built was paid in silence rather than grief. She wrote in her diary. She maintained her correspondence. She received visitors and conducted the ordinary business of a queen dowager. And the estrangement between Queen Mary and the Duke of Windsor that began in December 1936 lasted until her death in March 1953. 17 years. She didn't see him when he returned to Britain during those years. Their meetings were rare and carefully managed. The reconciliation that might have softened those final years didn't come in documented form before she died. A woman who couldn't express her love for her own children. A woman who watched the abdication with an iron face. A woman who spent 60 years turning toward objects, labeling them, cataloging them, dismantling and rebuilding them, as the one domain in which her feelings could be made precise and permanent. In this light, her relationship with jewelry becomes stranger and more psychologically coherent. The objects she had Gerard rebuild to her specification were the one thing she could control completely. Her children were complicated. The abdication was a humiliation she couldn't prevent. The war years brought chaos and grief. But the royal collection, the labeled furniture, the catalogued jade, the tiaras sent to Gerard and returned in forms she had chosen, those could be put in order. Those could be made to say exactly what she intended, to exactly the people she intended, for exactly as long as the dynasty needed them to say it. The pieces she wouldn't wear were also part of this control. The Teck crescent stayed in the box because wearing it would have been a statement about her mother's memory she wasn't ready to overwrite. The Surrey fringe disappeared because keeping it as received would have meant accepting an object on terms she hadn't set. The Ladies of England tiara became the lover's knot because the Ladies of England tiara, as a piece, reflected 650 other women's idea of what the new Duchess should wear. Queen Mary had a different idea. She was a woman who expressed herself through acquisition and editing, rather than through speech and sentiment. The jewelry record is her autobiography, written in diamonds and pearls and Gerard receipts, and it's considerably more honest than the controlled public face she maintained for 60 years. There is a detail in Pope Hennessy's account of her final years that is worth holding in the mind. He wrote that toward the end of her life, Queen Mary instantly noticed if even the smallest of her beloved objects had been removed for cleaning. She had catalogued the collection so completely, in her own hand, label after label, annotation after annotation, that she could detect a single absent piece among thousands. She also, in those final years, began cataloging her own life with the same systematic attention, docketing her papers, labeling her correspondence, annotating envelopes containing historical letters. On one envelope, containing a letter addressed to Queen Victoria from a family relation, she wrote in her precise hand, "Nice letter about me." 3 words. An archivist noting her own significance in the archive. A woman curating not just the royal collection, but her own place within it. She was editing history. Specifically, she was editing the part of history that touched her, with the same deliberate precision she had applied to the Surrey fringe, the Ladies of England tiara, the Collingwood piece, the Vladimir. Objects don't arrive in the right form. They must be shaped, annotated, redirected toward their most useful expression. This was simply how she thought. Gerard, the Crown Jewelers, executed every major alteration in Queen Mary's collection over 30 years. The Surrey fringe dismantling in 1913, the Ladies of England dismantling in 1913, the Girls of Great Britain pearl removal in 1914, the Collingwood fringe transformation in 1919, the Lover's Knot Commission across 1913 and 1914, the Vladimir pendant modifications after 1921, the Diamond Bandeau Commission in 1932, a new piece, diamond and platinum with 11 flexible sections, the County of Lincoln brooch serving as its detachable centerpiece, for which no documented photograph of Queen Mary wearing it in public has been located. All of it through the same workshop, all of it on her instruction. The consistency is almost administrative. A woman with a program, returning to the same craftsmen with her directions year after year, confident in their skill and presumably comfortable in the knowledge that they understood her expectations. Jewelry alteration was common in the Edwardian and interwar periods. Aristocratic women regularly had pieces reset as tastes changed, stones removed and reconfigured, settings updated. But the volume of Queen Mary's alterations, the speed of the 1913 clusters specifically, and crucially the provenance of the pieces she chose to act on, set her apart from the period norm. She didn't dismantle unfashionable items from anonymous donors. She dismantled gifts with specific dynastic and sentimental meaning. A Victorian queen's patronage, an organized committee of 650 women, a county's formal tribute, and replace them with pieces expressing her own dynastic vision. A tiara she didn't wear is a quiet choice. A tiara she had dismantled is an active one. The unworn piece leaves the question open. Why? The dismantled piece closes it. She decided. She acted. She made the material serve her purposes rather than anyone else's. When Queen Mary died in March 1953, she left instructions. The jewelry wasn't to delay her granddaughter's coronation, scheduled for June 2nd of that year. Even in her last directive about the collection, the institution came before the person. She had lived to be 85 and would miss the coronation by weeks. She had wanted to see it. The jewelry she left to Elizabeth II wasn't simply beautiful. It was engineered. Elizabeth inherited the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara, built from the dismantled Ladies of England tiara, the stripped pearls of the Girls of Great Britain tiara, and other collected materials. The piece made according to Queen Mary's specification in tribute to her grandmother's aesthetic, worn by Queen Mary herself in documented photographs only once or twice. Elizabeth wore it consistently through the 1950s, pairing it with the pearls and diamonds that were her own early signature. Then, in 1981, she loaned it to Diana, Princess of Wales. Diana wore it constantly and openly. The 19 diamond arches and 19 hanging pearls, built from the destruction of two 1893 wedding gifts, became one of the most recognizable pieces of jewelry in modern history. Specifically because Diana wore it, because the cameras followed Diana, and because the image of that tiara on her dark hair at state occasion after state occasion entered a generation's visual vocabulary. Diana reportedly found it heavy. She wore it anyway. After Diana's death in 1997, the tiara returned to the royal collection. It passed subsequently to Catherine, Princess of Wales, who has worn it extensively since 2015, including at multiple high-profile state occasions. The chain from Queen Mary's grandmother's original piece, reportedly created around 1818, through Queen Mary's 1913 or 1914 recreation, built from dismantled wedding gifts, through Elizabeth II and Diana, and now Catherine. Across more than 2 centuries of women and occasions, was seeded by a choice Queen Mary made in a year when she sent 2 tiaras to Gerard and told them to take both apart. The Girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Tiara became Elizabeth II's most recognizable piece. She appears in it on British currency. She wore it in formal state portraits across 5 decades. Gerard's own designers credited Elizabeth, not Queen Mary, with making the tiara famous. It's now worn by Queen Camilla. Those 13 large diamonds visible in the scrollwork as Camilla wears it today are the Surrey residence diamonds, the ones extracted from the county's wedding gift in 1913 and set into this piece as replacement finials. They have now outlasted 4 queens. Queen Mary sent them to Gerard in 1913, and they are still living out that decision. The diamond fringe tiara, rebuilt from Victoria's original gift in 1919, has been worn by 3 royal brides across 5 decades: Elizabeth in 1947, Anne in 1973, Beatrice in 2020. The Vladimir, modular and interchangeable in the way Queen Mary designed it, became one of Elizabeth's favorite pieces, reportedly described as quieter without the pendant drops, a description that unconsciously echoes the utilitarian logic of the woman who engineered its modularity. The Addingham Trust described Queen Mary as the first member of the royal family to approach the collections in their historical context. Apollo magazine, drawing on archival research, confirmed that, until her husband's death in 1936, Queen Mary held joint sway over the entirety of the royal collection. Then, as now, one of the largest surviving private collections in the world. When George V died in January 1936, the formal custodianship changed, but the collection's shape was largely set by then, pressed into the form she had decided it should take. She spent her final years reviewing what she had built, labeling, annotating, writing small notes on envelopes and placing them where archivists would find them after her death. Toward the end, Pope Hennessy noted, she could walk through a room of thousands of objects and notice immediately if a single piece was missing. That is the picture of a woman who had complete possession of every decision she had made about every object in her care. Not a passive inheritor of historic wealth, not a sentimental collector moved by beauty, a curator and an editor. A woman who looked at the collection she had received and asked, systematically, what it needed to become. The pieces she wore were the pieces that communicated what she wanted communicated: authority, imperial weight, dynastic continuity, a connection to the longest possible line of royal history. The pieces she didn't wear were the ones that communicated something else: someone else's generosity, someone else's vision, someone else's sentimental association. Those were held or redirected or rebuilt, pressed into new forms that served new purposes. She was a woman who expressed herself through acquisition and editing, rather than speech and sentiment. The object record, the labels, the Gerard receipts, the photographs of later queens in pieces she had built from earlier ones, is her autobiography. And it's more honest than the controlled public face she maintained for 60 years of royal life. Queen Mary's most revealing jewels weren't always the ones on her head. Sometimes, they were the ones she kept waiting in silence. Subscribe for more stories like this.